Thank you very much. Um, should we start with the hearing from each of the groups?
Yes.
Is that the, yes, okay.
Yes.
So Marie, would you like to start with your group? Oh, you got to unmute yourself.
Okay, I knew you'd do that. Thanks a lot. Okay. My group was really diverse and interesting, and I had the opening speaker in my group, which was wonderful and lovely. And I think what each person brought up, and we sort of concluded something, is that we need to create space for people to embrace, to explore and embrace their identities, whatever those identities are, whether the identities mean that you know, it's a Spanish heritage and you speak Spanish and it's okay, or if you're gay and you are part of a group and that's okay, but creating the positive space. The second thing was about the school experience. And the truth is that when you start in elementary school, from the time you start school, you want to fit in. And how do you go about fitting in and being proud of who you are? And that's a really big question. I've been exploring that question with my 9-year-old grandson. And I think the bottom line for me is that you love yourself and all that it entails, and being able to be open and honest about who you are. And that's very difficult. And the other thing is about, you know, being vulnerable and also being in touch with who you are at various stages of your life. It never ends. I mentioned, you know, my stage, and I have to be honest about what my stage involves and to be in touch with that. So it's a really difficult but dynamic question to explore throughout one's life. I really enjoyed the group and enjoyed doing this.
Thank you, Marie. I'd like to segue to Natalie because very much it seems like the two groups had similar discussions.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Romero. I enjoyed the conversation in our group because it did point out very specifically that we experience periods where we're in denial or periods where we take a stand when we're faced with situations at different cycles in our lives. I think what's important, as we discussed, was to never really let people push you into a box or make you feel like you need to be differently. In our room, we had someone who had the experience of feeling guilty because they grew up in one neighborhood that was predominantly or mixed culture and maybe on the lower income side, and decided as an adult to make that leap to, right, we all want to live in a better neighborhood. We all want something better. Yet as an adult male who has gone through looking at the stark differences from where he grew up and what he knew of the school system and what it allowed the young people to do, how they were not encouraged to go to college, they were not nurtured. Yet in this new neighborhood that he's moved to, he's really faced with the fact that now he's surrounded by a predominantly white community where his roots are more diverse from Guatemala, almost a version of an adult version of Lewis, our opening speaker. It's very interesting that you begin to feel overwhelmed, and it becomes harder and harder to look at the disparities as you get older or more knowledgeable. And then we had someone in our room who really never felt the urge to hide or suppress any of her heritage because she was very proud of it and thought she could use it in a very different way, but became victim to complaints, you know, going through cycles where people had things negatively to say about her, but she was able to really stay in it because from her vantage point, we're all different, but we are the same. We talked about the fact that there was a pastor at a church, and he was really rejected by the congregation because he had a very heavy dialect. But he had the courage to stand in front of the congregation and say to them, there are many different ways to speak English. And it's really making ourselves realize that although we may want to change ourselves, we truly are the same. And when we do change ourselves, for the persons that we're making this change, they in fact will only give us permission in a certain context or space. And so it's almost like a no-win situation. If you can't find a way to just be your authentic self and learn how to celebrate the richness of your culture or other people's culture, it's almost like we're recovering from a substance abuse because we're on this never-ending cycle of trying to please people or change who we are. And I just hope in speaking about it and learning more about how people are dealing with this, we are able to make some small changes in ourselves and in talking to family members and friends so that we can help to make a difference.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That's a marvelous blending of the conversations that we had. Dr. Clifton, do you want to share?
Well, I think we defer to Shaw.
Okay, well, Shah sent it to Nalini, right?
Yes, so I will report for Shah, even though it's not in his breakout, but I got his notes. Shah pointed out a few interesting dichotomies that were referenced in his group or discussed in his group. So the concept of suppression versus repression, the concepts of spirited racism versus ignorant racism, and appreciating the difference between the two and labeling the two differently. And the idea that, America, the image of America, our imagination of America is a rosy picture versus a reality in which we're really seeing people through the lens of their color, not everyone through one single rosy lens. And he also pointed out to, or his group, members who are here, pointed to social media reflecting two very different realities that are going on for people right now. Some are fighting for, please fill out your census form, please fill out your absentee ballot form, please make sure you vote, please make sure that you care about racial justice. And on the other hand, you have people posting about, well, here's my workout video, here's me spending time on the beach, what I'm learning to cook during the pandemic. And it seems like there's very different realities. And when we see that that difference in our social circles, that can be a little overwhelming. The other thing that Shah reported could be quite overwhelming is that when we belong to an institution and it feels like the institution is so big and so stodgy, it might not be willing to move, it might not be able to move. There's a reluctance to speak up and there's a reluctance to change. But it seems like the consensus, if I'm reporting correctly from this group, the consensus is that we need to find ways to dialogue and we need to find ways to constructively dialogue with one another. And so with that, I'll close. Mr. Romero, back to you.
Okay, so do we have one more group to hear from? Or is that, I'm sorry, who's the facilitator for the other group? Oh, okay, sorry. Malia, can we hear from you?
Hi, yes, we had such a wonderful group as well. We did a lot of dialoguing on personal stories that really echo what people have already mentioned. But some things that came out of the story were that a lot of us didn't find our identity until after we were out on our own, whether that was, breaking free of what our parents had told us to suppress about who we are, or that we were living in a culture that didn't actually identify skin color as an issue. They weren't aware until they came to America and then given kind of that identity and discovered that. And through that, we talked a lot about how identities can also become exoticized, I should say, if that's a word, and the dichotomy within that. One of our group members spoke Chinese when she got here and was learning English and was bullied, but at the same time they would ask her to write their name in Chinese or say something in Mandarin to be exotic. And then we talked a lot about wealth and how that also comes into play, and you would go to places or be a part of things, and it was either obvious or not obvious that you didn't have money, and you start to feel bad about kind of like where you came from for some people in our group. And you start to make excuses for some of the identities. When you're oppressing your own identities, you start to make excuses for why you cannot participate and show up in certain arenas, whether you want to or not. And because you're not expressing that, you get people who try to relate to you like you're the same. Had an example of one person who has money, the other person in the family didn't. And when they're dealing with lice, one person just went into the store and was like, bought the lice medication and did the lice treatment. And the other person was like, yeah, and then I had to get the lice expert, cost me thousands of dollars. You get what I'm saying, right? No, we don't know what you're saying, or like relative to how we live is what we experience. And also like through our experiences and where we place ourselves, we also notice that people will assume our identities and oppress them for us without permission. And meaning, there was an example of someone who went to the Hamptons and they weren't rich. They just happened to be there. And because they were there, they were assumed to be rich. And on one side, it's like, wow, this person is talking to me as if I'm an equal and getting to know me as a person, absent any kind of identity that they know. But at the same time, they're not taking into account who you are as an entire person, because that person felt that if they were speaking to the same person in the city, there actually would be an implied identity versus a stripped identity and how they relate to that person.
Wow.
Good.
That's very powerful. Thank you. Just to jump onto the story that you told, because we forget this, I think to exoticize the other is just as bad to look down upon. A former student of mine that I have on Facebook that I'm friendly with, she's about 30, I guess, has had over and over again, has had this negative experience. She happens to be Chinese, but in bars or in social gatherings, she'll have single men come up to her and say, oh, I just love Asian women, and can we start talking or whatever, and objectifying her. And she says that also, in the city when she's working, if she's walking around on lunchtime or whatever and on the streets, people will come up to her and sort of go like, ni hao hao, say hi in Chinese, people who are not Chinese. And what a presumption that is, to just assume that she's Chinese. She could be Korean, she could be, and again, to make the other person an object instead of, and that's another facet. It's almost the other side of the coin of the negative way of typecasting people as well. So all the groups have been heard from now. Okay, so just some closing thoughts. It is interesting that Lewis was the opening speaker and that I'm the closing speaker, because we almost are like bookends in the sense that I'm a generation or two ahead of where he is in terms of experience, in terms of what happened, in that my grandfather emigrated here in 1919, 1920 from Guatemala, and went to New York City and met a young woman who was Jewish, New York City born, but her parents were immigrants. And she must have been, a very progressive. I mean, I knew her as an older woman, but she must have been a very progressive young woman, because she married my grandfather and my grandfather, you know, was a recent immigrant from Guatemala, and he was dark skinned. And, you know, I think it did cause some problems in her family, but she went and did it anyway. And so my father, growing up in the 1930s, my father was born in 1923, that's when we had a melting pot culture. That was the official ideology, that we poured all the immigrants in and we stirred the pot and everybody came out as an American. And, you know, the problem with that was that on the one hand, yes, it was beneficial to try to create American values in terms of, you know, tolerance, respect, democracy, et cetera, diversity of religion. But at the same time, it forced everyone to suppress their cultural identities. And in case, you know, you don't know what the modern metaphor is, the modern metaphor is usually to represent how we look at this today is, you know, a patchwork quilt is sometimes the way it's described, or a salad where we all retain the cultural pieces that we have that are our own, and we don't have to suppress them. But at the same time, together we make up the quilt, or together we make up the salad. I may be a tomato, and you may be a pepper, but together we're one American salad. But that I don't have to surrender my tomato-ness, and you don't have to surrender your pepperness. I know it sounds ridiculous, but and you know, that is such a better way to look at, because each of us, certainly in our group, and it sounds like it was the same in the other, people at different times of their lives have suppressed who they were. And, you know, I certainly told the story that in teaching in a very upscale suburban high school, I felt absolutely uncomfortable acknowledging my own background, because it was so radically different from these very high-powered students that I was teaching. And there were times when I honestly did say, yes, I went to Brentwood High School. Yes, I went to Stony Brook University, and was met with a degree of derision to the extent that it lowered the respect that my students had for me. And so I suppressed it. And you know, that's harmful. It's a harmful thing to do. And you know, we live in a very white neighborhood, and when they held the first Black Lives Matter protest here, a bunch of middle-aged guys with beards and tattoos, if to stereotype here, showed up with, you know, "Don't tread on me" flags and American flags, and hurled abuse at the young people. It was primarily young people in the march, and yelled and screamed. And one guy actually physically, a middle-aged man, assaulted a young man and bloodied his face. And so our son, who's 20, wanted to go to the next march that they held in reaction to that. And, you know, we worried about his safety because these guys aren't going away. But we allowed him to go because it's important to make the stand and to stand up and say, no, this is wrong. And, you know, the only thing I insisted was that he go with my brother, you know, so that there were two people, they were two of them together. But my wife then put up a sign on the lawn, one of those lawn signs that said, "Racism has no home here." And the response in the neighborhood was that 3 people in the neighborhood proceeded in the next week to order Trump flags and to put them up in response to our "Racism has no home here." And, you know, now I look at it and I think, wow, why did we choose this neighborhood? Why would we choose to live here? And I've had to do some soul searching about that. And I'd like to end on a positive note in that I've been an educator for 40 years. I started teaching in 1981, and I'm still teaching, although remotely at this point. I'm teaching college part-time, and I have seen the changes that deliberate attempts to change the culture can make. And I'll give you two examples: bullying of children who are different, okay, and environmentalism. I have seen over time, and to some extent gender equity, I have seen, when I look back on the 1980s when I started teaching, and how when a child was being bullied for being different, we really didn't have any tools per se to work with that, right? Because all the anti-bullying uh, workshops and whatnot that we do today didn't really exist then. And I actually had colleagues who would join in on the bullying, right? That to make themselves popular with their own students, they would join in with the bullying. Um, you never see that today. Students today would never think to bully, at least students of high school and college age. You will not see them publicly bullying students who are different, and particularly students with uh, developmental disabilities, right? And that's because from kindergarten on, we have trained students now that yes, some people are different. Some people are unable to do the things that you can do. And our son has some developmental disabilities. And the one thing we never had to worry about, because again, he graduated high school in 2000, just 2 years ago, we never had to worry about him being bullied. We had to worry sometimes about him being excluded, because nobody can force students to socialize with your child after school. But the types of bullying that I used to see in the 1980s and early 90s, you never see that anymore. And the other thing would be environmentalism. We have trained students from kindergarten forwards to be conscious of the environment. And I cannot tell you how many times in the last 15 or 20 years I've had students say to me, Mr. Romero, don't throw that there. We need a separate can for, for bottles and one for paper. And, why did you feel the need to print this? We could have just put this up on the internet. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because if we now shift and we put the same emphasis, I really truly believe this, if we now, as a result of the awakening of the last 2 or 3 years, where we're finally admitting the truth that, now that we see it filmed over and over again on cell phones and body cams, when we're finally admitting just how unjust our society is, or some of us are anyway, um, if we make that same effort in education, I really truly believe we can change behavior, and hopefully change the interior as well, and that we will see a change over time, and that you know just like Martin Luther King said that he had a dream that children would be judged by their character. Um, I'm really hoping that we're going to get to that point where we don't see the differences, right? Where that's not the first thing we see: the color, the accent, whatever it happens to be, the economic divide. I really think that we will get to that place if we make the same effort, and nobody will be forced to hide the pieces of who they are. Thanks.